begin this week's shir, and we'll try to cover a number of different topics relating to contemporary issues in Kashrut. And if there are questions that you have along the way or other things you want to ask me about, please feel free to do so. At the Chicago Binnacle Council, we deal with many different kashrut issues. I just want to give you a flavor, I guess, of some of the stuff that I've dealt with over the past couple of years or so. So last week, we spoke about milk and how we certify cow milk nowadays, even without Chalav Yisrael supervision on the farm of there being somebody Jewish watching the milking process. And we brought the opinion of Moshe Feinstein, and we explained the special challenges that we have to deal with nowadays when there are other types of milk on the market, including camel milk, and how can we still certify that milk is being supervised based on governmental rules that require the milk to be cow milk, when in fact camel milk can be sold as well. And we gave an explanation as to why, based on labeling requirements, we don't need to be worried, and how we introduced legislation in the state of Illinois so that we can bypass any potential problems on a state level. Now, the underlying assumption and understanding, of course, is that there are certain animals that are kosher, of which the milk that comes from those animals are kosher. And there are certain animals that are not kosher, so the milk that comes from those animals is not kosher. So we have to step back for a moment, because we do a lot of shechita as well, meaning part of what the Chicago Binnacle Council does is that we shecht animals, we slaughter animals in accordance with Jewish tradition. We do oversee the slaughtering process now in several different plants. We used to have a facility here in the Chicago area. It was called Shepeti. It recently restructured its activities so that it no longer does what they call killing, slaughter on the premises. It was here in downtown Chicago, actually. Chicago used to be the major center for packing houses and slaughtering houses in the country, pretty much. And now you can't really find too many slaughterhouses in Chicago property, but Shepeti was one of them, one of the last remaining ones. Was downtown, and we were slaughtering lambs, slaughtering sheep. So you go into the supermarket and you pick up kosher lamb chops, so that would generally be coming from Shepeti. So they restructured their operations, and for a little while we were slaughtering lambs in South Wisconsin, but then there was some issue with that facility as well. So now we're not doing any shechita at the present moment directly here in Chicagoland. I don't know if you view that as good or bad, but from the perspective, at least, of our oversight and operations, it makes things a little bit more complicated. So we have to travel right now. The shechita that's overseen by the Chicago Binnacle Council is done in 3 primary facilities, 2 of which are in the United States and 1 of which is in Mexico. And there are Goosey Greeley, and Goosey Greeley sounds like touchy-feely, but Goosey Greeley, those are the names of the 2 facilities. One in Mexico is Goosey, and one near Denver is Greeley, and then we also have one in Dallas. Now, the one in the Denver area, we're slaughtering lamb, and that's what we call dacos. Those are small animals. The ones in Dallas and in Mexico, we're slaughtering gasos. We're slaughtering larger animals. So what are the larger animals? Cattle. Essentially, the 3 main kosher animals that are described repeatedly in the Torah and that are the main sources of meat that we eat in the kosher market are basically bakar and tzon and gedi. They are cattle and sheep and goat. Those are the 3 major different types of animals. Goat we don't really slaughter too much, so it comes down to really lamb and cattle that get slaughtered. There's also chicken, but we don't have a chicken shechita, at least under the supervision of the Chicago Rabbinical Council. On the other hand, if you look in the Torah has all kinds of different possibilities of animals that could be kosher. So why limit ourselves to just cattle and to sheep when the Torah gives us the basic signs of a kosher animal of being an animal that chews its cud, right? It's malei geira, and it's mafreses parsa v'shosah shesa, and it has split hooves. Those are the basic signs. It it chews its cud and it splits its hooves the entire way. So we know, why is it that a camel is not kosher? Well, the Torah says a camel is not kosher, but the Torah tells you why a camel is not kosher. So we know that its milk is not kosher as well. And that is that while it chews its cud, it does not have split hooves. And that's why a cow is not kosher. So if I had an animal that I saw in front of me that it splits its hooves and it chews its cud, then that animal should be 100% kosher. Now, the Torah gives you different animals that are not kosher, so we assume that most animals probably are kosher. The Torah says there are two different types of animals that you can eat. There are the behemoths, those are what you might call the domesticated animals, and then there are the chayos. Chayos are like the wild beasts or the wild animals that they run wild. Deer is an example of a kosher wild animal, a kosher chaya. How do you know if an animal that runs wild is kosher or not? So you just see whether it's described in the song Home on the Range. So if it's in Home on the Range and the deer and the antelope play, okay, so you know deer and antelope, so deer and antelope are perfectly fine. Deer, antelope, we'll throw in gazelle for good measure. We don't generally eat deer either. Deer would be venison. There was a time, maybe a couple of decades ago, it's while I was starting out in the practice of law. After I finished law school, and I practiced as a lawyer for several years, and they took me out and wined and dined me when I was interviewing for the different firms. They took me to the fancy kosher restaurants. So at that point in time, there were a couple of kosher restaurants in New York. One was called Levana, one was called Nanu, that sold venison, and that was considered to be like a tremendous novelty. You can go and you could eat deer, but it was a novelty, but people weren't that excited about the taste, and it didn't really last all that long. But beyond that, it hasn't really extended too far, and every now and then, there'll be a new strange animal that nobody heard of before that will be introduced into the kosher market, and the question will be raised, well, does it satisfy the criteria of being a kosher animal? The question, for example, is sometimes raised about a giraffe. So people say, oh, well, a giraffe, it's a problem, maybe not because it's not kosher, but you have to slaughter the two different simanim, the two different organs in the animal that are required for kosher slaughter. You have to cut through the kana and the veshit, the windpipe and the esophagus, the trachea and the esophagus in order for an animal to be kosher. And with a giraffe, the neck is so long that you're not going to be able to find it properly. But that's ridiculous because the trachea and the esophagus go through the entire neck, so it's actually easier than with other animals to shecht a giraffe. So that's not really the issue. So the question in part is, well, is the giraffe described in is it described in the Torah? Is it described as a kosher animal in the Torah? To which, and maybe it's the zamer was described as the zamer. But even if it's not described in the Torah, you look at a giraffe, it chews its cud, and it has split hooves. So why shouldn't that be sufficient? So we had the same issue with respect to South American and Central American slaughter. A lot of the animals, a lot of the cattle that's slaughtered is not what we would call pure cattle. It's cattle, which is also, sometimes it's what's called Zebu. Zebu is a type of animal that was at one point in time in Madagascar. There were a number of Zebu animals that were imported to South America a number of years ago, maybe 100 years ago or so. And now there's a very active Zebu flock. It was imported in the early 20th century. Exactly when that was, I couldn't tell you. I looked on Wikipedia, and it was crossbred with a European taurine breed, some other more traditional type of cattle. And over the years, a lot of the cattle, maybe even the majority of the cattle now which is slaughtered in South America is either pure Zebu or it's Zebu that was mixed with other breeds, but nonetheless has some Zebu in it. So the question that was posed by a number of authorities is whether we can rely on Zebu as a kosher animal. This really affects the kosher cattle market tremendously because so much of our meat comes from South America or Central America. We ourselves have a facility right there. Dallas isn't too far away, so a lot of the cattle that is being slaughtered, if not most of the cattle that's being slaughtered in this region is either Zebu or it has a Zebu mixed in it. So is Zebu considered to be a kosher animal? And this was something that was discussed by authorities going back to when it was originally introduced onto the market, maybe 100 years ago or so. And it was discussed a lot in the mid-20th century. And it came up again even around 10 years ago or so, because in Eretz Yisrael, they like to introduce new controversies just to kind of, keep people's, adrenaline flowing. So they reintroduced this controversy just maybe a decade or so ago about whether, in fact, people should be eating the Zebu or any of the cattle which was being brought in from South America. And this affects our own shechita, so we had to deal with this question. There's a secondary question, which we have to deal with as well, which is the Zebu, if it is kosher, let's say that we determine that what we need are these simanim, these different indications of Kashrut, as spelled out in the Torah, that it chews its cud and it splits its hooves. Is it a behema? Is it considered domesticated, or is it considered to be a chaya? What difference does it make whether it's a behema or whether it's a chaya? Well, there are two major differences between whether an animal is a behema or whether an animal is a chaya. One is that after you shecht, say a chaya, wild animal, say it's a deer, or for that matter, a chicken, they have a requirement that you cover the blood. You have to do kisoy yadayim. You take some sort of a dirt-type substance and you cover the blood. And this is a real requirement. It slows down the process also because you have to make sure that you have the right type of material in order to perform the mitzvah. And it's a real whole mitzvah that has to be performed with respect to fowl or chicken, and also with respect to chayos, like a deer. So kisoy yadam is only required for those types of animals, but not for domesticated animals. So for lamb and for cattle, you don't need to do kisoy yadam. The second thing is that the chaylev, there are certain fatty parts inside of the animal that have to be cleaned out of the animal, because the Torah says you're not allowed to eat chaylev, you're not allowed to eat from certain fats of the animal. But that's only a prohibition with respect to behema. It's only for prohibition with respect to, say, cattle and lamb and your traditional domesticated animals, but it's not a prohibition with respect to chaya. So those are two major differences between knowing whether it is a behema or whether it is a chaya. But you say, okay, fine, so we'll work it out. Or maybe, you know what, we'll be stringent in both directions. We're not really sure, behema or chaya, so we'll cover the blood, and we will avoid the chaylev, we'll avoid the fat. But why do we have to make a federal case over this? After all, it chews its cud, splits its hooves, so why isn't that good enough? So it's a very interesting discussion, which really begins with a history of the kosher determination of a fowl, of chickens, for example. So the Torah tells you which types of fowl, which types of birds. It gives you a list of 24 birds or so that are not kosher. So you can figure out, okay, that's great. I have 24 birds that are not kosher. I know all the other birds are kosher, right? So that's perfect. So I just have to be able to identify these 24 birds. So it's hard to identify because they have weird names, and maybe in one country they're called by one name, in another country it's called by another name. There's 70 different nations of the world, and there are all kinds of names that you can call fowl, so you can't tell whether a chicken is a kosher or a non-kosher chicken. So the Gemara gives different types of indications as to how you can tell that a fowl, whether it's a goose or a duck or a chicken, how you can tell that it's kosher. If it has an extra toe, if it has a crop, if it has a peelable gizzard, and it's not dores, it doesn't trample, it's not like a predatory bird, it doesn't trample other birds. So you figure, okay, fine, so the Gemara gives some signs, some indications, but then there's a story in the Gemara where they thought that a certain bird had all of these signs and wasn't predatory, and then one day they noticed that there it was acting like a predator, trampling on some other bird, and who knew, and then they realized, oh, we're going to have to prohibit this bird forever after. So Rashi, in his commentary to Maseches Chulin, just makes an oblique comment. He says, well, because these tests of determining kashrus based on the signs that are given in the Gemara is not foolproof, as we see from this case of the chicken, this swamp chicken that unexpectedly turned out to be a doreset, turned out to be a trampler, predatory chicken. Therefore, we only consume chickens, we only shech chickens if we have a misorah. We have a tradition. If we have a tradition that this is a chicken, it was a fowl, that was always known from time immemorial throughout the generations, people knew that this was a kosher. This was what raised an issue at a certain point in time when there was the discovery of turkey, right? Christopher Columbus, as we all know, he discovered turkey. So when he came to America and discovered turkey, so when when turkey became spread to the European market or kosher consumer had never really seen or heard of a turkey before. So the question was, can we rely upon there being a Masorah? Is there any type of a tradition with respect to turkey? And eventually it was decided, because it took so long to figure it out. So while all the rabbis were figuring it out, people were so busy consuming the turkey that, at a certain point they said, well, it seems to be a tradition after all, because, for the last 50 years everyone's been eating the turkey. So turkey became accepted as a fowl that was that had a tradition. But up until this very day, there are certain families that are actually stringent, that are actually very careful not to consume turkey. They won't impose this upon other people. They're even great rabbis. They won't impose it upon necessarily even their own family, but it's known that they stay away from eating turkey as kind of a personal stringency, because who knows if there really was a proper Masorah, there was a proper tradition. And the truth is that turkeys really are very different in many ways, physiologically, from your traditional chicken. And for example, the Horowitz family that comes from the Shlah, the Shnei Luchos Abris, the famous personality, the Shlah, who was himself from the Horowitz family, so they have a tradition not to consume turkey. So I have a friend who's a Rosh Hashiva at YU, his last name is Horowitz, and he comes from the Shlah, and he doesn't eat turkey. So this is kept and observed in certain families, but for the most part we've adapted in that particular way. But even in Eretz Yisrael right now, so you have to keep up with all of the latest controversies. That's our job at the Chicago Binnacle Council. It's very entertaining because we keep up with all of the new controversies in Israel. And one of the major new kosher controversies is with respect to Breckel Chicken. There's a chicken called Breckel Chicken, and the Breckel Chicken, some say this is like the greatest, most authentic chicken ever that we can rely upon as having traditions that the old shoftim, the ones who are like 110 years old, say, yes, I remember this is what we used to chef in Europe. And others say, no, we have no tradition for this whatsoever. So there's a whole big question as to whether this is the ideal, like Platonic, chicken in the cave, they looked and saw the Breckel chicken, or whether this is a chicken that you should stay away from at all costs because it doesn't have a proper tradition. So, but that's all within the realm of chicken, and we understand in the realm of chicken because the Torah doesn't tell us what this, it just gives us a list of non-kosher fowl, but it doesn't tell us what the signs are, what the kosher signs and characteristics are for a chicken. It tells us, though, what the kosher characteristics are for a behemoth or a chaya. So why isn't the fact that the Zebu chews its cud and splits its hooves, why isn't that considered to be good enough? So this part of the equation really depends upon an interpretation of a commentary, a very famous commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, and that is the Shach, the Shach Seikon. The Shach Seikon, 17th century, I believe. So in his commentary to the Siman, to the chapter in the Shulchan Aruch that talks about chayos, it talks about how can you tell if an animal is a beast. So the Gemara talks about it, says, well, there are different signs, which are called mefutsalos, kruchos, haduros, and charukos. Those are all different code words that are mentioned in the Gemara as to how, if you look at the horns of a chaya, it will have these characteristics, and that's how you know that it's a chaya, and you have to cover its blood, and that its fat would be permitted. Those are the signs. You remember how when Yaakov was separating the sheep from Lavan and figuring out like which should be his and which should be Lavan, so if it was speckled or spotted or streaked, you remember all of that in Parshas Vayetze, so then it would belong to him and others would belong to Lavan, and you say, and the conditions are constantly changing. So this is like along those lines. What do these mean? Well, if a chaya is mefutsalos, that means if it's forked or the antlers are branched off, so then you can assume that it's a chaya. And if it's kruchos, if it's not mefutsalos, and it has these other features of kruchos, which means it's sort of rounded, and it's chaduros, it's pointed, and it's charukos, it's notched. So if it has those three characteristics together, so that also would be an indication that it is a chaya. So there says the Shach, this is all very nice, but how would you know how to visualize and conceptualize these things? Like I can say the words, notched, forked, and these other definitions of pointed and rounded and all of these other things. But how do we really know what that means? So he says, so he says that I'm not going to elaborate on any of this, because since we only have what we have received according to tradition, as is spelled out later on, Gabi Simani Ha'of, with respect to the characteristics of a kosher fowl, Katzarti. Therefore, I have condensed my comments, because anyway, we're going to rely solely based on tradition. Yes?
What is the source for this focus?
What is the source for?
What is the source? Where is the shop learning this?
Where is the shach learning this?
Like, is it an empirical thing? You went out and said, okay, this is the division that I've seen, or is it sourced from food?
The shach is presumably speaking from either his own svara, his own rationale, that he's saying that I don't have a clear tradition and therefore nobody else does either, because I'm the shach. So if I don't know, it must be that nobody else knows. Or the shach is inferring that since we require tradition with respect to simani of, with respect to the chickens, so too it must be that we are heavily reliant upon tradition when it comes to any realm of kashrus, of defining what is kosher and what is not kosher. But before we get to that, there are three different interpretations of the shach. So one interpretation of the shach is, this isn't talking about, this chapter in Shulchan Aruch is not talking about whether the animal is kosher or not. This chapter is talking about, is it a chaya, is it a wild animal, or is it behemoth, is it domesticated animal? Nothing to do with whether or not it's kosher. So one interpretation of the shach is, he's not going to elaborate upon how can I tell whether it's a chaya, whether it's a behemoth, but as far as it being kosher, of course it's kosher. So that's the interpretation of the Pri Megadim, famous Lithuanian commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, Pri Megadim, source Ches over here. He says it just can't have anything to do with whether or not it's kosher. You look at the third line, he says that Vehema Vadai ein Bekias Lahakim Afresis Parsa Umalas Gera. He says that it clearly doesn't take any great expertise to determine whether an animal chews its cud and has split hooves. We can figure that out very easy. He says, but the real question is whether it's a chaya or whether it's a behemoth. Because there are so many different explanations how I look at the horns and can tell whether it's notched or forked or spotted or rounded or whatever else in order to determine that it's the horn of a chaya. So you shouldn't eat the chaylev, you shouldn't eat the fat. And assume that it's a chaya in terms of eating the fat, unless you have a tradition. Because we don't understand, or we're not experts in all of the different signs that are described in the Gemara regarding how to detect that the horns are the horns of a chaya, ushara simanim, and all of the different characteristics that are mentioned in the Gemara. So that's interpretation number one. According to interpretation number one, no problem with the zebu. You can eat it no matter what. Maybe we won't eat the chaylev, maybe we'll do kisoy adam, just in order to be stringent in both directions, but as far as eating, no problem. Second interpretation is that of the Chachmas Adam, known as the Chai Adam. Chai Adam, also Lithuanian, very, very famous figure who wrote the seminal commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, on the Code of Jewish Law. So he says like this, he says, Ulefi she'enanu ochlin, this is the fourth line, Ulefi she'enanu ochlin ma'ashigvanu mesoas me'abosenu, v'imkein aso lanu lechol min hachayas rak hatzvi shenikol lanu. He says, since we require a tradition, as we say with respect to the birds, so therefore everything goes to the birds in the sense that the only type of chaya that we are allowed to eat is the tzvi, is the deer, the antelope, basically that which is clearly in the deer family. However, we cannot eat anything else that is a chaya for which we don't have a tradition. So the limited, or I suppose the narrower interpretation of this Chai Adam is to say, the Chai Adam is not saying that you can't eat something which doesn't look like a chaya at all. He's saying that if something appears to be in the universe of chayos, based on the way that its horns grow, it appears to be in the universe of like the deer and the antelope, but we just don't have a tradition about it. It's not recorded in the Torah, so then we shouldn't eat it. But if it's in the behemoth family, so then we would be allowed to eat it. That's kind of one interpretation of the Chai Adam. But there's a third interpretation or it's it's the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish basically has a second interpretation of the Chayei Adam, which would be the third interpretation, I guess, of the Shach. And the Chazon Ish says what the Chayei Adam really means is that if we don't have a tradition about a particular animal, and we can't identify it as a chaya or a behema, and we don't know what it is, we just don't have a tradition about this animal, so then he says it doesn't matter whether it would fall into the chaya camp, whether it would fall into the behema camp, you just cannot eat it, period. That's what the Chazon Ish says, and the Chazon Ish carried on a correspondence with the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel after the establishment of the Medina, who was Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog. Specifically, although the word Zebu is never mentioned, but it appears that they were corresponding about the Zebu, which in those days was known as the Indian ox. It got around a lot. I don't know, Madagascar, India, I don't know, South America. It just it traveled, very, very far. It was very cosmopolitan. So they appear to have been talking about the Zebu, and Rav Herzog was arguing maybe there really is a tradition about the Zebu. Chazon Ish says no. This is a min chadash, and according to the Chayei Adam, whom everybody follows, whenever there's a min chadash, a new species that we do not know about, we do not have a tradition about, we cannot eat it. It's considered to be treif. It's considered to be off limits from us. And he says that clearly what the Chayei Adam and what the Shach really were getting at is that ein lanu ela behemos kvasim ve'izim, that all that we have that we're allowed to eat, at least outside of deer, all that we're allowed to eat that appears to be in the behema family is behemos, kavasim. Behemos really means cattle, kavasim. Son could really include both kavasim and izim, so kavasim is a better term. Kavasim, lamb, izim, and goats. Okay, cattle, lamb, goats, period. And the Chazon Ish also did not understand why in the world people should have a need for more than those three things, because how much of a mefunak, how spoiled do you need to be? If we are able to eat these three different species, then you should be able to be satisfied in life, and we don't need to find new species to give a stempel of kashrus upon. So he says this is basically the tradition that we have, and we're not allowed to add anything more to that. And even though the Pri Megadim says differently, the Pri Megadim is not the authoritative final word, because the final word is that of the Chachmas Adam, because Sifro is Pashe B'Dor Chol Eretz Lita, because his sefer, his work, his treatise was spread throughout the entire land of Lithuania. What else counts for Lithuania? And therefore, his word is our final word. And if you think I'm making up like the kind of philosophical spin of the Chazon Ish, he says explicitly, what do we need it for? Come on. You can get all the hot dogs, hamburgers, whatever else you need from the buck of its own, from the cattle and the sheep. Let's leave it at that and go on with our lives. Yes?
Is buffalo cattle?
So buffalo is another major dispute, the bison. The buffalo seems a lot like cattle, and here there was also a back and forth based on the Chazon Ish. If there wasn't a strong tradition that certain buffalo bison was kosher, so maybe we shouldn't eat it, maybe we shouldn't consume it. So in the end they said, well, there appears to be, even in the Shulchan Aruch itself, it mentions buffalo. Buffalo is mentioned as a kosher animal. So we have, going back to the Code of Jewish Law, codified by Yosef Karo, a mention of buffalo. It's very difficult to say that it's not a kosher animal. There is confusion, though, about whether it's a behema or a chaya. So the minhag, the custom, when it comes to buffalo, is that we are stringent in both directions. We will cover its blood, assuming in that regard that it's a chaya, but we will not consume its chalif, we will not consume its fat. So we do follow two stringencies. But the interesting thing is that with Zebu, we don't seem to follow the Chazon Ish. There were those, Rabbi Yosef, towards the end of his life, came to this conclusion that we really should reconsider what the Chazon Ish said, and we should prohibit the Zebu, and we should prohibit all this cattle coming from South America where there's the Zebu mixed in. And then Rabbi Belsky, who was the Kashrut, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was one of the Kashrut advisors of the Orthodox Union. So Rabbi Belsky wrote his own treatise. It's called Shulchan Alevi. And in it, he says that Rabbi Elyashiv was prepared to basically prohibit the Zebu for everybody, until he discovered that essentially most of the meat that we were eating comes from the Zebu. And not only that, but we're drinking milk from the Zebu, because Zebu is like, it's cattle, so it's like cows, so they have milk. And he says we're drinking Zebu milk. And not only are we drinking Zebu milk, but we're also writing a lot of our klafim, our tefillin are being written on the parchment of the Zebu. So when all of this was revealed, so he says somehow Rabbi Yosef at that point backtracked, and the consumption of Zebu was saved for Klal Yisrael. However, what's interesting is that the Zebu, we don't observe these two stringencies. We do not both avoid the chaylev. We do avoid the chaylev, but we don't also do kisoy hadam. We do not, in addition, cover the blood the way we would for a deer, something that we're not sure that maybe it's a chaya. So why is that? So that in part is because of a tshuva that was written by Rabbi Meshulam Roth. Rabbi Meshulam Roth came from Galicia, born late 19th century, moved to Eretz Yisrael, escaped, I don't know how, somehow he got out in 1944 in the midst of the Holocaust. He made his way to Eretz Yisrael, and he was a great Rav, a great posek. And he was asked specifically about these Madagascar animals, which we understand were the Zebu, okay? And he says that he thinks that there is no question whatsoever that the Zebu is a kosher animal, because as long as we can establish that it, number one, does not number one, it has split hooves, and number two, it chews its cud, that we can establish it as a kosher animal. And the Gemara throws in that an additional indication is that it doesn't have like upper molars, we'll call it a nibi, and it doesn't have these upper molars in its mouth, so therefore all is fine and good. And then he says, if you look in source Yud Gimel, and kisoy, even when it comes to covering its blood, whenever you're not sure if it's a behema makaya, you, in addition to avoiding eating the chayil of the fat, you also have to cover the blood. Because he says it basically looks exactly like your regular animal. I mean, look at the picture of your regular cattle. It's a regular cattle, it has a tiny little hump, but the hump is essentially just a muscle. It's not, fat or anything. It's really nothing that changes its fundamental appearance from looking like a regular cow. And therefore he says it looks like a cow, it acts like a cow, it therefore is a cow. And not only that, he says, but I spoke to these zoologists. The Rabbanim in Paris, now we're bringing Paris into the picture. Everybody got into this. They wrote in the name of the zookeeper there, the Sham Shivasipre Zoologia, that if you look in these zoology treatises, Shalahem Nimnes Ben Behemos is counted as a behema. So what more do you want? So he says you can rely upon these zoologists. Now the Chazon Ish was not so excited about that. If you go back a page to the top of page 4, and he says, he says, what do I care? I could care less what the zoologists say. The zoologists didn't learn Gemara. The zoologists don't know how to learn a Pri Megadim, a Chayi Adam, a Shach. They take their own tests, they have their own schools. There's nothing to do with Gemara, there's nothing to do with us. They don't know how to identify the different signs of the horns and so forth, so therefore I couldn't give a toot as to what the zoologists have to say. But Rabbi Meshulam Roth said, no, this is what the zoologists say counts. If you look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara says that Rav wanted to get a third smicha. You know how we give smichos? Like we give, most rabbis have, when we say you have smicha, you have Yora smicha. The basic smicha, when it comes to giving instruction regarding what's permitted and what's prohibited. That's called Yora. Then there's the secondary smicha. I have the secondary smicha, which is Yadin, which is in Jewish jurisprudence. That's the secondary smicha. But there's a third smicha, which there's no smicha program on earth which awards this third smicha. Maybe you want to start something here in Shishon, be interesting. It's called Yatir, which means that you permit an animal which is a firstborn animal, a male animal which is born to its mother. So a firstborn animal really should have been brought as a korban, as a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash. Nowadays we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we don't have a holy temple. So when it's supposed to be, given to a Kohen, so what do you do nowadays? So nowadays, if the Kohen wants to eat it, he has to wait until it gets a blemish. If it gets a blemish, it's invalidated from being brought as a korban, and then it can be eaten outside of the Beis Hamikdash. But you needed experts to determine when the animal had received a permanent blemish. So Rab wanted, and that requires a smicha. requires a lot of training. So how did Rav train for the smicha? He spent 18 months, according to the Gemara, studying with a zoologist. So we see that what the zoologists have to say really does count for something. Now in the end, it happens Rav did not receive the smicha, but one of the reasons, because he also had another colleague, it wouldn't have looked good that he got the smicha and the colleague didn't get the smicha. Side reasons why he didn't get the smicha, but the way that he trained for it was by learning with a zoologist. So now another very interesting pointer, which is thrown in over here, by Rav Shlomo Ammar. Okay, there are two different sources. So Shlomo Ammar used to be the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. He's now the Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem. That works out well because, once you leave like the most exalted position, what are you going to do for the rest of your life, right? It's like being a retired president. It can be very, very boring. So he got himself a nice position. He's a very, very fine man. Also, I know him personally. He's now the Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem. So Rav Shlomo Ammar wrote a whole tshuva about, there was a question regarding, it's not entirely clear what this creature is. It's called the Ayel Adom, the Australia. Sounds like some sort of a ram, an Australian red ram. And there was a question whether it's kosher or not. And he determined that it has teeth in its upper molar, so therefore you can't assume that it's kosher. But in the course of his discussion about how you can tell whether or not an animal is kosher, he said, who says that we even know, forget about being able to look at the horns and figuring out whether it's forked or whether it's rounded or whether it's spread out or whether it's pointed or notched or these other types of signs that the Gemara talks about. He says, even in terms of the basic signs of whether it chews its cud or whether it has split hooves, who says that we're the biggest experts? He says, I spoke, Misha'alti, le'echem me'emer, for some in mechakmas zoologia. I spoke to my own zoologist. And he said, sometimes an animal looks like it chews its cud, but it doesn't really chew its cud. And he gave an example of a hippopotamus. Which apparently looks like it chews its cud, but it's not considered halakhically as one that chews its cud. And he says, he says maybe because of these considerations, this is why you do have poskim who say that you should not rely solely upon our observation of there being simanim of the animal, and maybe the simanim, the characteristics that we think we're seeing, are not really reliable. But what's interesting as well is that Rabbi Ammar clearly was comfortable relying upon zoologists. So if he was comfortable relying upon zoologists, and Rav in the Gemara was comfortable relying upon zoologists, and Rabbi Shlomo Ammar was comfortable relying upon zoologists, you know what we're going to do in the end? We're going to rely upon the zoologists. So therefore we say that when it comes to the cattle, when it comes to the Zebu, we're going to treat it like cattle, and we're going to say, number one, that it's kosher, and number two, that it doesn't even require to have its blood covered. And even in the midst of Rabbi Ammar's tshuva, he makes kind of like a shout out. He gives a shout out as he's in the process of completely postulating and invalidating for consumption this Australian red ram. He throws in a shout out for the Zebu. He says that as far as the Zebu is concerned, in Malisha Eloheinu Behemos means Sabu or Zebu, that Rav Herzog said is perfectly kosher. Shemotzim Mehodu Kiyom Nimsim Riboy Godom Dinas Brazil, that you was sold all the time in Brazil. And he said that these were Hitivu Osam. They determined that these had all of the kosher signs, and you don't have to worry about them altogether. Then I have here an article where the Toronto Bad also came to the conclusion that you can permit Zebu, but for totally separate reasons, because they said they've been crossbreeded so many times over the generations that most of what you have now is not really Zebu, but it's mostly regular cattle with a little bit of Zebu. So the more you have just a little bit of Zebu, the less you have to worry about certainly its origins in terms of being a chaya. So for all these reasons, we came to the conclusion that we are comfortable shechting the animals in South America and Central America that look like cattle, even if they are zebus or they come from zebus. We are perfectly okay with it. Number one, maybe there is a tradition about zebu. There were poskim who said that there is, like Rav Herzog, that people ate zebu from time immemorial. You'll say, oh, but we didn't eat zebu, so that doesn't count. If you don't eat Zebu because you didn't have any Zebu, that doesn't mean that you had tradition against Zebu. If you didn't eat an animal that was walking around in your neighborhood for hundreds of years, so that might mean that you have a stringency not to eat that animal. But if it wasn't within your neck of the woods, so you don't have to worry about it. And number two, as we saw from the Pri Megadim, it's very likely that we don't need a Masorah, that we only need a Masorah, we only need a tradition when it comes to fowl, when it comes to chickens, but not when it comes to Zebu. Okay, fine. I'm going to put that aside for the moment. Now, I also said I'm going to talk about donuts and medical marijuana. So I'll talk about that a little bit too. What's the question when it comes to donuts? So donuts, we know it requires supervision to make sure there are no non-kosher oils, there are no non-kosher ingredients, and no non-kosher equipment. But what could possibly be the kashrut issue with donuts? And then we'll get to medical marijuana. So one potential issue that a kashrut organization has to think about is, well, do we certify when we're giving a kosher certification on something that it is good for you, that something is actually healthy? In other words, one of the ways in which kashrut is touted is that we tell people, well, you keep kosher, so, because it enables you to live on a very high plane spiritually, but presumably also physically, that the food is, healthier for you. But if you're giving, hashgacha on things that have all kinds of trans fats or saturated fats and are going to cause people's arteries to clog, so maybe that's something that we should think twice about. So how does that play out halakhically? I'm not talking about eating donuts during Hanukkah. Obviously, that's a mitzvah gedola. Because you find the minhag of eating sufganiyot, however defined, but it meant like some sort of a doughy, oily substance. You find that in the writings of the father of the Rambam, Rav Maimon. It's a minhag that goes all the way back. You figure the Rambam was Rav Moshe ben Maimon. So you gotta, give Rav Maimon some credit too. Maimonides, he's part of the name, Maimonides. So Rav Maimon is not famous for so many things other than having a son who is the Rambam. But he actually is the one who introduced or records this custom of eating sufganiyot on Hanukkah. So everything has a time and has a place. But on the other hand, you also have to be worried about health concerns. So let me just briefly review the sources. The Torah says in a couple of places that you have to take care of yourself. You have to take care of your body. That one of the imperatives in the Torah is, in addition to making sure that the animals that you eat have the kosher signs, the chewing the cud and splitting the hoof and all of those things, you also have to make sure that you are not harming yourself or hurting yourself in terms of anything that you ingest. And the Gemara in Chulin says that we go a step further, that something could be prohibited, like it's basar v'chalav, it's meat and milk, so we know it's prohibited, or it's prohibited fats from a behemoth, we know it's prohibited. But if something's a sakana, it's a danger, like a poison that you're going to ingest, it's like a physical poison. We know that Mesilas Yesharim Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says that you should view all non-kosher food as poisonous in the sense of wanting to stay away from it, the way you stay away from poison. If something's mamish poison, it's really poison. So the Gemara says, Chamir Sakanta Meisur, something which is prohibited out of danger is even greater severity, greater stringency than something which is prohibited simply because it's a non-kosher food, but it's not inherently something which is a poison, which is going to kill you instantaneously. And the Rambam in Hilchos Otseach, the laws against not killing people, says that you're not allowed to endanger yourself. And you have to, and somebody who endangers themselves, they get makas mardus. They actually get lashes. Makas mardus sounds like it's lashes on a rabbinic level, but it could be that it's lashes on a rabbinic level, but some say it's a Torah violation of this imperative of Nishmatim El Nafshosechem, that you're obligated to take care of yourself. And he gives examples. He gives examples if you're going to drink water straight out of a dirty pipe. Like water is running through, filthy water going through a dirty pipe, coming from a person's sewage, and you put your mouth against it and you drink. Things of that variety, or you go out to the swamps and you drink from the swamps at night, and maybe you're going to eat some sort of a parasite and it's going to be very bad for you, or water that was left uncovered that may have been drunk by a snake, for example. So all of these things, and the snake ingested the snake put its venom in the water that you are now ingesting. So all of these things that the Rambam says you're not allowed to do. And in fact, it's something that we're very, very careful about. Not because there's anything intrinsically prohibited about it, but because the Gemara says that it's dangerous for us. What's that? What's the thing that we don't eat, even though it's the combination of foods that we don't eat, even though it's not strictly us, it's not treif, but we don't eat it because the Gemara says it's dangerous. What is the example? Fish and meat, where even though the Rambam doesn't even record this prohibition against fish and meat, even though the Magen Avraham, in his, another great commentator, Avraham Gamiter, in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, he says that we don't have to worry about fish and meat nowadays because everybody knows that it doesn't hurt you anymore, and therefore now it's perfectly permissible. But other Meforshim say, don't pay attention to the Magen Avraham. If the Gemara says it's dangerous, then it's dangerous. The Gemara says it's dangerous because it causes davar acher. It causes something else to happen to you. What's that something else that's going to happen to you? Saras, leprosy. So no, you didn't see anybody get leprosy, but since it says that something will happen to you, so you have to worry that maybe something's going to happen of a different nature, or maybe it's happening on the inside in some way that you can't fully detect. So therefore we're kind of worried, since the Gemara says it's dangerous to us, for us. The Gemara had said that if you leave out liquids overnight, like water overnight, you can't drink it because a snake is, potentially going to drink from it. But nowadays that we don't have snakes, the Shulchan Aruch says you don't have to worry about that anymore in terms of just drinking it. But that's because it's explicitly tied together with snakes. If you know there were no snakes, you don't have to worry about it. But here, if it says davar acher or something's going to happen to you, so we're still worried something. We're so worried that even though the Gemara only said it's a problem if you cook the fish and the meat together, we're worried even if the fish and the meat weren't cooked together, they're just going to be on the same plate. I'm just eating from the same fork without, washing. I got to have my special fish fork, my regular fork. We go overboard about this. I once heard from Rosh Hashanah saying we're so careful when it comes to not mixing the fish and the meat. There is even a discussion: is it nullified if you have 60 portions of something else? So if I have a little bit of fish in a meat dish, and there are 60 portions of meat to nullify the fish, so do I say that it gets nullified? And there are some opinions that say no, it wouldn't get nullified because chamir sakanta meisura, because danger has to have a higher threshold of nullification than something which is just prohibited in the normal course. There's a whole discussion about that in the Piskei Tshuva that I have in the source sheet as well. So I heard from Rav Shechter once saying we're so careful about fish and meat, so why are we giving hashgacha on foods with trans fats, or foods that are going to clog a person's arteries? That maybe that's something that we should have pause about. This relates to the whole discussion about whether it is appropriate for the rabbis to prohibit smoking. This was a question that was posed to Rav Moshe Feinstein on a couple of occasions. Rav Moshe Feinstein cited the pasuk, the verse in Tehillim that spoke about Shomer Pesayim Hashem, how God watches over the simpletons. Or as my grandmother used to say, God protects the idiots. So the pasuk is used in the Gemara to indicate that if people do something and they're not worried about it, even though there's some measure of danger, if it's less than 50% danger, so God can be counted upon to protect people. Like, for example, a pregnant woman or a nursing woman or a very young woman giving birth, which the Gemara says can be dangerous, but since everybody does it and they don't worry about the danger, so therefore we say Shomer Pesayim Hashem. In a couple of cases, a couple of places, the Gemara applies this principle of Shomer Pesayim Hashem. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, if you are a Ben Torah, you shouldn't engage in excesses, for example, and therefore for that reason it's appropriate to stay away from smoking. He doesn't recommend smoking, but he says I can't categorically prohibit smoking because since everybody does it, and there are also, you go to a hospital, and it's true, there are people who have cancer because they smoke, but then there are people who have cancer because of all kinds of other reasons as well, and we can't say that this is so much more dangerous than living life in any other way. He says, he says that the danger of getting sick from this is such a small possibility. This was written maybe 50 years ago. And certainly to get cancer from it, he writes the word explicitly, interestingly. He says, it's such a small possibility that therefore you shouldn't worry about it, because you'll find many, many more people who are sick from other things other than those who are sick from smoking cigarettes, and therefore for that reason he says we would say we would say that God watches over the simpletons. But if you look in the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, right, who was the official posek, the official halakhic decisor of Shari Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, so he had a different perspective. Now he wrote his tshuva when already the Surgeon Generals and so forth had alerted the public to how smoking was not simply a small, trivial concern, but was one that really was responsible for many, many deaths and perhaps the major killer of any type of any type of condition or any type of habituation of activity in America and in many, many other countries. So Tzitz Eliezer wrote that it is impossible for us to say Shomet B'Sayim Hashem. So Lo Amu Ken, and he wrote this about 35 years ago. Lo Amu Ken Lo Nisgala Basam. He says that's only with respect to things where it is not clearly and unequivocally revealed that they are dangerous. And the reality has not shown us that it is completely the opposite of what people think. And he says, but in this case of smoking, that according to all investigations and reports, it's been revealed just how incredibly dangerous this is. That everybody throughout the world recognizes that this is one of the major killers of all individuals. So he says, he says, it is absurdi. It is absolutely created a word. It's absolutely absurd lahalim ayin to hide our eyes because from all of these facts. And just to kind of cavalierly put it aside, regarding this, we would say Shomet B'Sayim Hashem. Therefore, he says it's absolutely prohibited. So I read articles, and there was someone who pointed this out, that if you look at the major killers of, what do people die from in this country, so number one, smoking is still very, very high up there, but after that is obesity. And if obesity is the second major cause, what causes obesity? That you're eating like the trans fats and the saturated fats and, the incredible, doses of calories from really, really fatty food. So then that really should give us pause with respect to the notion of eating things that we know are really bad for you, that are really, really fatty in nature. So what then is the answer as to how we can give hashgacha on these different donut stores? And notice I'm not mentioning any name explicitly because I know I'm being taped here. And the like, so how can, we do that? So the answer probably is that, if you look in the Rambam, in the Rambam Hilchos Deis is talking about how people should just behave on a day-to-day basis. The Rambam says you shouldn't overeat and you shouldn't overindulge yourself, and he gives various foods. He says if you eat too much of this, it's very bad for you. However, when it comes to just foods in general, as opposed to say like smoking, which is something people don't eat altogether, so people do need to eat, that when it comes to most foods, if you consume them in moderation, or for example, you only eat the donuts when it's a mitzvah occasion, like Hanukkah. I used to eat a donut every day of Hanukkah. Is it like a hiddur mitzvah? I felt that every single, I would start like with one, then go to two, and so forth, I felt that was like a hiddur mitzvah on Hanukkah, but my wife eventually talked me out of it. She said, maybe that's okay when you're like 15 years old or whatever, but, at a certain point, you have to acknowledge your age and take a greater, care of yourself. So, but if you eat things in moderation and just at the appropriate time, so it doesn't become automatically treif per se, but at the same time, I think that it does behoove kashrut agencies, rabbanim, and the like, just like we give musar to everybody about staying away from other averos. It's also an avera to hurt yourself by overindulging or eating too much of fatty foods or eating too much of sweetened beverages, even if you don't have to pay tax for it. And it's something which I think even if you give a hashgacha, because taken in a vacuum, having one portion every now and then is not necessarily usher. It's important to point out that if you do this on a regular basis, that type of behavior certainly is usher. Yes.
But how are you going to be able to those are things that if you go ahead, if you almost anything we eat, it's just a matter of quantity. Like, for example, chicken driven, I think has hashgacha. I don't know about CSCOU, but my wife clearly passoed that hashgacha, so I'm not allowed to bring it home because I love it. I grew up in Romania, so whatever. But or the Romanian pastrami, which half of it is. So you can go. This is like the obvious things, but you can even have a very healthy food. I don't know, noodles. right? And which are...
Well, yes, of course, you could take anything to an extreme, but there are certain foods that lend themselves to a greater health risk than others. That's simply the reality. I don't think that there's any escaping that reality. And when you're dealing with, those types of foods, so it's just important to, to point that out and to have that sense of a perspective. Yes, Rabbi, welcome.
Imagine 20 years from now, technology could allow you to go to a supermarket and the Hextra could have a computer chip and it could, do your blood, it could disappear if you've had too much of,
I would say something else also, which is that, stores and products go with the time. So if the medical knowledge and expertise of the time says stay away from trans fats, and you have most of the companies and most of the stores really trying to cut down on that because it said that you should stay away from it. Even one establishment that sells donuts really took tremendous strides in the last 10 years to cut out their trans fats and the like. If there's one store, one product that says we're going to ignore all of that, just like they would say, oh, we're going to continue to have smoking, or we're going to continue to, promote, trans fats in excessive measure. So I think that from a kashrut or hashgacha perspective, that is a relevant consideration in terms of deciding to give hashgacha. So just the last thing that I would throw in because I promised it, is the medical marijuana. So CRC now does give hashgacha medical marijuana. So the question is, why are we doing that? Is that just an excuse to, enable people to consume marijuana? Marijuana can also be very, very bad for you in terms of playing games with your mind and, doing terrible things and really, hurting a person, causing them to become addicted. Hitmakrut, addiction itself, is something which might be, prohibition in its own right, but Moshe Feinstein talks about a little bit in the smoking context. So why do we give hashgacha to medical marijuana? So this is because it's medical marijuana, because the Shulchan Aruch rules that whenever it's a question of really lightening a person's medical condition, so just like you're allowed to break Shabbos, it says Siman Shin Chav Ches, in Shulchan Aruch, you can break Shabbos in order to relieve a person's medical condition, especially, everybody would agree that if a person is going to feel good, they're going to feel better, and they're chol sheish bo sakana, there's somebody who is terminally ill, and they're going to be relaxed and calmed and soothed by a particular food that they can only receive if you're Mechal Shabbos, you break Shabbos for them, then you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos for them in order to soothe them to soothe them in any which way. So the same would be true with respect to medical marijuana, which has been proven without any question to have this type of soothing effect on individuals. And he says, if you know that if you're going to deprive the person, then the person is going to be in worse shape. So then for sure you can provide the person with you could be Mechal Shabbos on that basis. You can provide food for somebody that would otherwise be prohibited. So we would not give hashgacha on marijuana in general, but medical marijuana we do feel is appropriate. What hashgacha do you need? Some people think it's because the plants might have insects growing on them, but the truth is that for the medical marijuana, you're not smoking the plant. I've never done this, so I'm not like an expert on what you do with marijuana, just for the record. But if you would be smoking the plant itself, so maybe there would be some sort of an issue with worms or insects that would be there. We haven't investigated the plants for insects, but here what you're doing is extracting the oils. You're extracting the oils, and you're enabling the oils to go into the bloodstream, either with some sort of a pen that they have, some that can be shot into the bloodstream, or it's mixed. I think vapor pens, or it can be mixed together with other ingredients and then made into like chocolate products and other things of that sort. So if it's made into chocolate products and it's mixed together with other ingredients, it's made into brittle or brownies or granola or things of that variety, so then the main kashrut supervision that you need is with respect to those other ingredients, obviously, or even the solvent which is used in order to process the flour into the oils. You have to use a solvent, and sometimes they use a non-kosher solvent. There's equipment, you have to kasher the equipment. So that's the nature of the kosher supervision which is required. I remember that there's another product, there's like an e-cigarette. An e-cigarette that people use. Why do people use e-cigarettes? That's in order to wean themselves away from actual cigarettes, but apparently they're not necessarily so good for you, the e-cigarettes. So there is a hashgacha agency that provides hashgacha for e-cigarette, and it's called the CRC. So I would get, but it's not us. There's a CRC with a ribbon, and then there's the CRC with a castle. We're the CRC with the castle. I don't know which one came first. For some reason, neither one has sued the other. That's very nice, Shalom Yisrael. but it sometimes creates a little bit, and I'm not encouraging it, but it sometimes creates a little bit of confusion. So I would get angry emails from consumers saying, how dare you give hashgacha on e-cigarettes? And we'd have to explain that we're not looking to impugn the other agency or anything, but we're not the ones who actually give the hashgacha on the e-cigarettes. But with respect to the medical marijuana, we really came to the conclusion that we're not looking for people to misuse it. It's really for people who have terminal conditions, and it's going to ease their load. And there is hashgacha that needs to be provided. There needs to be implemented in order to ensure that only kosher ingredients are used and that only kosher equipment is used. And that's something that we're proud about doing, because that's for the purpose of bettering people's quality of life. But every single case has to be looked at very carefully in its own right. I'll take a couple of questions, then we'll wrap up, so you can go home and learn Torah, because what's the point of watching Game 7 of the World Series? How interesting could that be? Yeah.
Why is medical marijuana considered, especially in that oil form, considered food that needs a Kashrut? Why can't it just be considered a medicine and sort of?
Well, even medicine, the truth of the matter is that if people have the ability to consume medicine that has a hechsher, people will want to do so. In other words, what we're dealing with is a population that really wants to imbibe things that are kosher. Just like if I go out and I want to get if I have a vitamin that I want to use, so I try to get kosher vitamins, because I don't want to put non-kosher ingredients in my body. If, let's say, a person is sick and there's a medicine prescribed by a doctor, and the only medicine available has a non-kosher ingredient, but they really need it, just to save their life, so of course they're allowed to ingest that medicine. But if they have the ability to have the same medicine available without any non-kosher ingredients, so of course that's better.
What is the fact that people have, inflation to certain things, like that they require more? Does halacha require?
Yes, there is this idea of timtum halev, okay, which is this described in the Shulchan Aruch, that whenever you ingest something which is non-kosher, so it does something, it weakens one spiritually. So you're allowed to weaken yourself spiritually if absolutely necessary, but people would prefer not to. And also it becomes a little bit of a question. It becomes a little bit of a question if you have, for example, two choices of something that you can take that would that be good for you medically. One of them is kosher and one of them is not kosher, so of course you're supposed to take the one that's kosher if it is available to you. So our job is to try to make it available to people. If it wasn't available, so then your question is a very good question. It could conceivably be permissible anyway. If a person has a terminal illness and it's going to really have a beneficial effect in terms of prolonging their life, it becomes a more complicated question, because this isn't the thing that's going to save the person's life, is the thing that's going to make the person's life a little bit more comfortable or take away some of their distress. It would allow chilul Shabbos, so do we say that therefore we shouldn't worry about kosher issues altogether? So fortunately we're averting that whole problem by dint of providing kosher supervision. But it's also that it's meaningful to people, just like lahavdil. I think here the kosher supervision is more important. But just like people want to buy plates that have an OU on them, because they want to be assured that there was no non-kosher ingredient, that somehow is absorbed inside of the plate, or water that has hashgacha. So if a water company asks us to provide hashgacha, we'll usually tell them, unless there's some bug issue that really requires a supervision, but usually that's not the case. So with the water that's being certified, we'll usually say it doesn't really need certification. They'll say, but we want to provide we want the certification because it's meaningful to be able to attract the kosher consumer and show that it's something that we care about. But here I think that it's more meaningful, because it's something which could conceivably really not be kosher, and this way you're enabling it to really be kosher. Okay, thank you. I'll take one more question and then we'll break.
Marijuana. Someone smokes marijuana. Does that need a hechsher in any way?
So I was talking about that. So if it's the weed itself, so we have not gone and investigated the insect infestation in the leaves. With a lot of our produce, we give recommendations if you're going to eat it, so you have to rinse and you have to wash and you have to inspect in the following fashion. Like we just revised our inspection criteria for strawberries because we saw an unusually large infestation in the strawberries, this particular season. So that's something that we check. But here, we're not dealing with the leaves themselves. We're dealing, if they would be dried to the degree that, the insects would definitely be burned, it would be dry like a piece of wood, so then you wouldn't have to worry about it. But the amount of smoking that goes on does not cause it to be dry like a piece of wood. That's the last source that I included in the materials. You can look at, what the standard would be for that. So you probably would have to, inspect it. But we're not recommending, smoking marijuana because we don't think it's a good idea. It's something which
Well,
is,
why is it
I
different
think,
than
prohibited.
cigarettes? Cigarettes, no one gets to have.
What?
Cigarettes, no one gets to have.
There's a heksher for e-cigarettes.
No, regular cigarettes.
Regular cigarettes,
The
I
same
don't know.
plant infestation issue could be.
Yeah, for cigarettes, a plant infestation.
Well,
I don't
tobacco
think-
is a plant also.
I don't know, but I don't think, but you're not actually smoking the plant, right?
Because there's a filter.
Right, here, you're actually taking, I don't know, does anybody know anything about smoking marijuana? I think that you're taking the weed, and you're smoking the weed, and you're not. So you'd have to, so you'd have to be a little bit concerned about that.
Lucky strike.
With the ones with the plants that are being used for the medical marijuana, it's also being grown in very controlled conditions inside an environment where it's not actually even on the ground itself, where you could say that it's removed from the ground. It's what we call a pot that doesn't have a hole in it, where it's possible that any insects that would be there could possibly be permitted anyway because they're not actually coming from the ground. So it would be much more problematic if you were going to be smoking, real, marijuana leaves. But again, as I said, not my expertise, not the subject of this discussion, and something which is illegal, according to the law, and also I believe also as a matter of halacha, because it can lead to addictive behavior and also dangerous behavior. So I would say, without equivocation, that it's absolutely prohibited, if that's helpful. Okay, yes?
Is smoking as a means of taking something in general, you would think that would need to be kosher also, like with an incense. If you smoke a cigarette or marijuana, nothing's going through your esophagus, right?
I don't know. A lot of the poskim nowadays, like the Tzitz Eliezer and the Rivvo Sefaim and Chaim Greenblatt, also wrote a tshuva, say, and the RCA, the Binnacle Council of America, the Halacha Commission of the Binnacle Council of America, say that now that smoking has been proven to be so deleterious and detrimental to your health without, any question, and there's so much overwhelming evidence that it causes death and causes terrible suffering and causes such danger to society that it really would be prohibited nowadays. So, it's prohibited anyway.
If these are the forbidden
If I'm going to
foods.
smoke, someone decides they're going to smoke regardless, but they know that there's non-kosher bugs in the leaves.
I don't think that the poskim considered smoking in general, like regular smoking. I don't think they considered it to be a kashrut issue. I don't think that is.
So why for marijuana are you saying would be an issue?
I think the marijuana, you're smoking the leaves, are you not?
But nothing comes into your mouth. Only through the smoke that's coming into your
Yeah.
mouth.
If you're eating brownie.
Right. That for sure.
I'm just saying, if you're smoking something that looks like a cigarette, I'm only asking. if
You're not
like
the-
kashrut's rules.
have the
You're
wrong
not wrapping it up and putting it in your mouth. Okay, so again, depending on how it's ingested, as I said, I'm not entirely sure, how it's done. But it could conceivably, depending on how it's done, it could conceivably be a problem. Just one more thing to throw into the mix. You shouldn't do it anyway. Also, maybe someday you're nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, and then they'll discover you smoke marijuana, and then you'll become disqualified. So why take such a chance? Okay.
Thank you.